Escaping the Fold by Vincent Merkel. Over the mountains and far away, continued. First, I completed the construction of stone walls to enclose my cave. I allowed for slots smaller than standard windows to let in light and to provide places from which to shoot my bow. I sewed my collection of tanned pelts together and made a roll from them that could be used with stakes as a tent or a generous bed sufficient for a full-grown man. I fired my ovens and smoked meat and fish. I used my stalls of flour made from cattails and baked my breads. I hunted the forests and took down a small deer whose pelt became something of a backpack and whose meat I jerked with salt, smoke, and sun. I worked the balance of the metal straps from my crate into a machete, ground sharp on stone, and with a smaller scrap of steel fashioned a keen edge to dress my spear. Using the machete, I harvested about 60 small trees and chopped every limb suited for the task of bearing my weight into pegs to build a ladder up the granite wall that kept me confined on the beach. I began inserting the pegs into the holes and within days had progressed almost halfway up the cliff. I carried bundles of pegs and drove them into the holes drilled by a man whose memory had faded from time. One dusk, as the sun was setting and I was high on my scaffolding, I looked from my perch and saw the most curious thing. The tribe of monkeys that usually followed me around and kept me company were not with me. I looked from the side of the mountain out to the sea. There was the black figure that hated man. The spiteful dragon was in the tide of the beach. From my vantage point, the otherwise colossal creature looked small and insignificant. On the sand in front of him were the less developed progenitors of man. The tribe of monkeys that had befriended me was engaged in some way with Lernea. I could see the biggest of them, the king of their tribe, running back and forth on the sand while his followers were all facing the devil of the sea. Night was coming. I went back to my home, now fully stocked and secure. My ladder was 2/3 done and would need another 200 pegs to reach the summit. I fastened my door tight and lay on my bedding. I thought about an island that I had begun to see on the horizon when I was hanging precariously from the side of the granite wall, inching my way upward. It was a fairly vast mass of land, hazy and desaturated like a mirage, but it was real. I imagined that my friends were there. When I got to the top of the stairway, I would burn a fire at night and wait for a response. But then the monkeys kept company with Lernea, and I knew I must sleep because the morrow could bring me much travail. Things seemed to be in order. Preparations for the ascension to the summit of the cliff, the dividing wall between the north shores and whatever lies beyond, was almost complete. I knew that Lernea had been trying to communicate with the monkey tribe, probably to convince them to attack me or betray my location on the island and disrupt my attempts for security and escape. I did not think that those little creatures would pose much of a problem for a number of reasons. First and foremost, I understood the primates to have an attention span that lent itself only to endeavors of immediate self-preservation, changing their moods minute to minute. A fight over territory with another tribe member always gave way to the discovery of a plump morsel of fruit or a juicy worm found in the rock of a fallen tree. They appreciated the simpler things of life and had no contracts other than those they saw as eminent threats to their safety and foraging rights. Secondly, their social structure was one of intimidation. The fiercest of the monkeys were the kings and princes of the tribe. It was with brute force that they earned the respect of their subjects, and their reign was merciless and fueled by the same force that many people claim is the cause of all wars. That force was hunger, the affections of their women, and their right to inhabit the world with their progeny. Yes, it is a male-dominated world where successful acquisition of food, land, and progeneration depended on the brutality of those that dwelled in the highest branches and owned the mightiest fighting fangs. If I could defeat their king, they might fear me and disband their army, but that might not be the case. From observations, I had noted that when they fought, the majority of damage to any opponent of the king was dealt by the king himself. The subjects, being cowardly, would cause a lot of noise and loot their neighbors' food stashes or steal a moment to mate with their brothers' wives when the king wasn't watching. If I were to fight, I imagined that the mightiest would come forward first, and after disposing of him, the next might join the fray. I knew from watching the little men that they would probably try to grab and pinch me while the fiercest of their gladiators were at attack. I hoped this would not be the case, as it would take a day to fight them from their sheer numbers. The light obliquely shined through the openings in the stone wall of my little fortress. My sleep was disrupted only by the sound of Lernea's warped laughter and siren song, occasionally passing in the near sea, searching for a rejoinder for the fulfillment of his promises of misery. I had stuffed leather in my ears to ensure restful sleep, so upon waking and relieving my ears of the stuffing, I heard the chatter of monkeys outside congregating in my cove. I looked out of one of the portals and to my dismay understood that starting my journey up the mountain might prove difficult if I could never open my door due to the many numbers of the mischievous primates. It was evident that they had been there a while, as they had torn my mud and stone oven apart and dragged the burnt and black stones out of the cove and onto the trail leading to the beach. They threw skins that were drying on stretchers out onto the jagged reef, where they rested on exposed corals beyond the sandy berm. I could not know that the king of the tribe waited for me, leaning against the door to my home in the cliff, aware that I was on the other side. I thought to sneak out while they dismantled my settlement. They were not just destroying it. I understood they were making a path for Lernea to follow. Why else would the monkeys carry only the burnt stones from my encampment to the outer beach and leave them on the shore? Why did they drag the wooden frames I had built for sun-dried fish and hang them from the cliffs at the entrance to the harbor? Those affected by the spell of the deceiver would use any evidence of my existence to betray me to their master. I could not yet know that the beast would have many opportunities to use his devices to thwart my plans for escape. Slowly, I tried my door and felt the weight of the bull monkey, a 60-pound warrior and the king of his clan, whom I had named Mangas, a Greek colloquialism for tough guy. He had the evidence of many battles written on his skin. He was a well-muscled primate indeed, and fearless. The very moment his mass shifted from an attempt to inch the wooden door open, he barked out orders to his minions. The frenzied group of invaders elevated their activity at the sound of a frantic shriek, a war cry. Hundreds of the monkeys, screaming and chattering, barking, froth hanging from their yellowed teeth, converged upon my home. They swarmed, throwing sticks and their foul products at my walls and into my windows. Mangas pulled and jerked upon my door with great effort, but my abilities as a builder were greater than his as a destroyer, and that faithful door held up to the relentless attacks. I thought his advances would surmount the sturdiness of my construction, and my faith and peace of mind wavered, but the door held to its purpose. I tried to aim an arrow out of the closest window as screaming monkeys filled the jambs with clawing arms and fingers, and I could not get off a shot. I tried lancing the little creatures and succeeded in killing a number of them. Their strong fingers held on to the spear and they drew it out from me. 20 or so monkeys stole my spear. All the while, in the distance, every so often, as the day grew hotter and the sun rose to the top of the sky, Lerner called a sickening sound, his encouragement to the now deranged monkeys, doubtless from the cover of his cave out in the blue. The eyes of the hairy tree-dwellers were bloodshot and red-rimmed. There was no break in their frantic attack. I tried bribing the unfortunate beggars with dried fish and sweet fruits, but there were no takers. They were focused on my destruction. My walls held to their prying fingers, and my attentions focused on preserving the wooden door. I pushed my crude machete through the gaps around the door and through the wooden slats, and a hungry blade found much blood. This was the most effective way of maintaining the integrity of my slowly failing barricade. The cave became stifling from the sun beating down upon the stone walls. The fight lasted until about an hour before dawn, when an abrupt and eerie trumpeting from the direction of Lerner's shadowy dwelling far away from the battle broke the incessant monkey skirmish. Their shrieks and barking finally ended. They calmed and slowly began clearing from my doorway and out into the jungle. They were wrecked, weak and hungry. They were ragged and bloody. The fight had taken a toll on the clueless monkeys. A half hour passed before I felt confident enough to open my door. The almost dead weight of Mangas slumped down the stairway as I pushed open my wooden access panel. He was breathing and appeared badly slashed over his entire body. Had the power of the beast controlled his weak mind and stolen his instinct for preservation? With limbs severed by my blade, had he continued throwing himself into my defenses until the siren called the end of the attack? His flesh was torn and ripped from the fangs of his subjects as well as my knife. I bent down on my knee and looked into his eyes. The mighty king of monkeys looked at me through his clean amber lens with a look of sorrow and wisdom, and lifted his hand in supplication. He laid the back of his hand on my knee and pierced my soul with his sadness. Those bright eyes gave no indication of malice. He wanted me to forgive him, but since I spoke not his simple language, there was no way to show him the mercy of my heart. I poured some water into his mouth, and it spilled out. No, this would not do. A mighty king cannot die, defeated in battle for righteousness, or having succumbed to the evil one, with shame and regret. This was no way to remember the king of the tribe that saved me from a lion. I slipped the edge of my long steel blade through his ribs and into his heart, and watched the tortured life force of Mangas deliver itself into the unknown. Many of the tribe of Mangas lay dead in the cove. More than I had slain lay there, blood rimming their eyes and mouths mixed with the froth of fanaticism and exertion. The sun began to disappear behind the horizon, and light gave way to darkness. I spotted my spear floating in the bay before the sandy bar. I walked in the shallows and waded deeper in as the light faded. The moon was overhead. A waning half-moon dimly illuminated the bay. On the beach, with my feet once again protected by my boots, and body clad with leather, weapons, water, and backpack, I would try my escape while the monkey tribe of Mangas was free from Lerner's spell under the cover of night. First, I would take care of the dead. as I might need to return to the cove and did not want to return to a place of demise and disease. I stacked a pyre intermingled with the bodies of monkeys, careful to touch them only with my spear. With my hands I placed Mungus on top, and before lighting the brush, heard the dreadful song of the siren at the reef, the entrance to my home. I fastened leathers to my head, tied them tight, and watched. Now the creature knew exactly where my home was. His fool victims left the traces of my life scattered about the cliff walls. There in the ocean swayed the laughing form of the beguiler. His serpent appendages reached up to his hideous head, one blazing dot of blue fire dimming in the distance. The snake-headed arms lifted up on the head, and an echo of a foot being pulled from a muddy trail filled the air. It was a slopping and wet noise that permeates my memory. Those long, fanged fingers lifted his head higher and higher, and the collar of his massive neck began to separate from the trunk of his body. A cold chill filled the air as Linnea pulled his head not off of his body, but out of it. The blue speck of light vanished, and where his head was, the hole began to fill with a new head, as if giving birth to a new kind of evil. A more fearsome countenance emerged, black and putrid, similar in its construction to the old one, with two refreshed sockets of blazing blue light, even brighter and colder than before. Linnea, still holding his old head, the root of which was the tail of a colossal eel, began to swing the writhing abomination and threw it over the reef and onto the sand dune. It slithered into the safety of the lagoon, while Linnea's silhouette danced a mocking parody of victory, showing off his new being and its disgusting profile. I lit the pyre that quickly roared, and it shone on the form of the massive eel swimming towards me. It was a full 20 feet long, with a circumference of about 6 feet at its thickest point. From one of its eye sockets protruded the shaft embedded to the fletching of my arrow. The eel closed the distance between the reef and my shore. The one good eye emitted no light, but his form was traced by a constant field of electrical charges. I briefly looked to the flames of the blazing funeral fire. It burned hot and high. I said a prayer to the monkey god once again, and asked him to watch after the spirit of the courageous Mungus, and then I resumed my journey into the jungle. The god of monkeys was not my god, although I believe the gods were closely related, or at least conversant with each other. On my trek through the forest in the early evening dusk, thoughts of Linnea regaled my conscience. It was clear that the ancient creature of the deep was well versed in war. He was schooled in the ways of language and rhetoric, and spoke to the lowest of those beings that engaged in societies. He was crafty, as I have already stated. He worked well in the application of the arts of division. His timing was always perfect, and he seemed to always be ahead of my learning curve. He spoke only lies, even when speaking tidbits of truth. He broke the silence and peace for the sake of disruption. I know the darker side as well. He hated women, at least enough to wear them torn and tattered as jewelry around his waist. He had matured over the millennia to be a most despicable and unsavory sort, using all of the tools that a devil could imagine to bring the basest of his desires to fruition. Linnea taught me well that it is not enough to take out one eye of the beast, because evil in one eye is no less evil than in two. I witnessed the nature of evil. When his head is wounded, he simply sacrifices it to his cause and assumes a new one. No, it is not enough to pluck out one eye from an evil creature. It must be fully destroyed, or shackled with the heaviest of chains to the greatest of stones, and plunged into the deepest fishes in the bottom of the ocean. When I was on my scaffolding on the granite cliff the day before, I witnessed the interaction between Linnea and the Monkey King and his clan. I had noted that Mungus was running back and forth in front of the lesser primates. His back was to the evil beast. It was possible that even with a weak mind, his courage was enough to keep him from the trance of the water-bound agitator known as Linnea. As a king, Mungus might have even felt the threat of a creature outside of his realm trying to usurp his right as sovereign ruler amongst the monkeys and fought to preserve his authority. It could be that he was a friend to me because I killed the lion that stalked his family and he wanted to repay me. I do not know. The romantic part of me wants to believe that I beheld humanity in that animal and accorded him the heights of nobility because I was lost and in need of a friend. I might have murdered the only creature on the island that would protect me, Mungus, the king of the North Side monkeys. I was almost to the base of my ladder at the cliff before the grove. I walked quickly and quietly, gnawing on pieces of jerked venison seasoned with salt and wild onion, and thought about which god could allow the abomination of Linnea to exist in this world. The jungle was still upon reaching the base of the sheer cliff that sported my dowelled stairway. It ascended to the heights of the lonely island. To the left was the stone face. From it protruded 3-foot-long hardwood rungs, 1 foot of which were inserted into the ground-out holes that spotted the stalwart tower. I began climbing up the pegs, much like a staircase, with the overhead handholds to stabilize my body on the thin treads. The light was low, and when my feet felt for the pegs, they found them with ease from the memory of building the upward escape. After 30 minutes of methodically climbing, I emerged above the shadows of the forest canopy 350 feet above the ground. The waning half-moon lit the great escarpment like a screen on which I was an actor, playing the scene of an acrobat. On the way up, I had missed a number of the steps with my faltering feet, as the supports had been missing from their slots or mysteriously broken at the stone. Upon reaching the altitude that met with the treetops, a ruckus broke out from the swaying tree limbs, and 40 or 50 monkeys, gaunt, peaked, and as gray as a live monkey could be, began to jump between the peg ladder and their lofty branches. They jumped to my legs and clambered onto my body, pulling at anything that would give way to their greedy fingers. They pulled the laces from my boots, jumped upon my head and shoulders, and tried the pegs at my feet. I moved steadily upward, intermittently pulling the obnoxious monkeys from my head and throwing them to the forest floor far below. The bundle of pegs tied on my back was weighted down with a large number of the crazed animals, and they occupied the pegs above and below me. Holding on with one hand overhead and feet planted on the steps, I raised my machete in my right hand, and it rained monkey blood on the canopy of trees below. I would not let the little imps stop me and climbed upward, punching and hacking the spiteful individuals one by one. 100 I cut and dropped to their deaths. They relented only after I had reached the last peg sticking out of the mountainside. They jumped to the wooden dowels below me and began to pull them from their cozy sockets, leaving me with no safe way back down the cliff. At that point, I was 2/3 of the way to the top. My body was protected by the lion's skin and leather headdress. My legs and arms were tired, sore, bitten, and pinched by a number of the little bastards. None wounded me grievously, but my blood dripped from 200 feet above the treetops. There was 100 feet of slick and naked stone face to my left side that had to be surmounted before my feet would feel the solid ground. They ached from the hours of strain and localized pressure on the slim arches that maintained the burden of my weight. I stood on the ladder, wall to the left and air on every other side, and tried to rest. I knew I did not have enough rungs tied to my back in the bundle to furnish steps for the entirety of the climb, but there would be enough to space out. Placing them in holes for every other step would get me almost to the top. With bent knees, I reached for a peg from the bundle at my back and leaned precariously forward to insert it into the next hole. I placed 4 pegs and climbed up. Then I repeated the process again a few times. At one point, leaning on a wooden step that was not as sturdy as the rest proved to be a terrible error. The wood snapped under the concentrated weight of my body, and I fell. Gravity was in full control as I simply plunged straight down towards the branches and hard earth 500 feet below. My hands had just placed a peg into a mortise, and I clung to that piece of wood for dear life. The downward moment of my body jerked upon the tendons in my arms, and my fall ended abruptly with a snap. My heart was fully in my throat, and I held to that rung with determination. The package of wooden rods at my back tilted, and I watched in dismay as the 3-foot lengths fell to the earth. I heard them hitting the treetops and ground as they bounced down the granite cliff without a care. I dangled from one single peg, laden with my backpack and weapons. The weight of my food stores, canteen, and the paper I brought along to write these events to you to recount my adventures mocked me with their useless presence. I chuckled to myself as the words dead weight suddenly took on a new meaning to me. I was spent from battling the rabid little hairy tree folk all day. Many times I tried my stomach muscles and swung my legs for a foothold to relieve my arms and pull myself up. I could not let go with one arm to separate myself from the weight of resources that was neatly packed in my deerskin haversack. The placement of the closest peg was just out of my reach. I once caught my boot on a rung and began to lift my body to safety when the laceless shoe slipped from my foot and disappeared into the dark void of the night. So I just stopped moving and called out in my mother's tongue, "My God! First the shipwrecks, and then my only salvation is a maddened octopus who wants to rule the world. I am crying for monkeys." I continued with my rant in English. "Why, Lord, am I here? I am sure you will answer soon, but please, God, also let me know why you have allowed this evil beast Linnea to exist for millennia, and yet you take my life in a moment. What have I done to deserve this fate?" I looked out to the sea and thought that the moon was beautiful and unusually bright for a half-lit orb. It reflected on the faraway waves, but the sky on the horizon was dark and above lit with stars as thick as the heartiest soup. My arms and fingers were weakening under their 220-pound load. Soon I would meet my Maker. The moments in life that things become clear, I should say, that point when God spoke and I heard him, was the most peaceful time. He then revealed to me a secret. Through the softest breeze and the sound of my beating heart and conscience, he told me where I went wrong, and I understood him. Only then did I hold myself to account for the misdoings of my life. I made up my mind that it was better to be at peace with God and plummet to the earth than simply to plummet to the earth. I do not know why I had this feeling. It just felt right, but I would not let go just to die. I tried swinging my lower body again. I thought maybe I could reach the peg, but it was too far. My fingers began to slip ever so slowly. The ground below would welcome me with a thud, and I would enter into the next life or nothingness. I regripped the wooden dowel and evenly pulled the weight of my body upward when a few pebbles and some dust spilled into my upturned face from the top of the mountain. It got in my eyes and I was temporarily blinded. I spat the dirt out of my mouth and something long, like a snake, jumped from the top of the rock 30 feet above my crown and hit me square on the forehead. It was a rope. It was a beautiful and divine rope, doubtless woven by the jewelers of the gods. A tether, long, light, and sleek, fell to my face. I grabbed it quickly, and with a few twists of the wrist, my arm was secure in those blessed fibers.